At the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, where the desert meets the sea, and 3 continents nearly touch, there is a strip of land that has been contested for longer than almost any other on earth. It has been called many names: Canaan, Judea, Palestine, the Holy Land, Israel. It is a small place about the size of New Jersey or the island of Sicily, a land of hills and valleys, of ancient olive trees and limestone cliffs, of a sea so full of minerals that nothing lives in it, and a river that has carried the weight of civilization for 10,000 years. The story of this land is one of the oldest in human memory. It begins, according to tradition, with a man named Abram, later called Abraham, who lived in the ancient city of Ur, in what is today southern Iraq, in approximately the year 2000, before the Common Era. Abraham heard a voice, a calling. He described it as the voice of God, a voice that told him to leave his home, to travel to an unknown land, that this land would belong to his descendants, that through his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He went. He traveled west through the Fertile Crescent into the land of Canaan, the land that would one day become Israel. Abraham settled there. He had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. The 12 sons of Jacob became the 12 tribes of Israel. This is where the name comes from, because Jacob was also called Israel, a name that means, in the ancient Hebrew, one who struggles with God. Tonight, we follow the story of these people and of this land from that ancient beginning to the headlines of today. Slowly, calmly, from the very beginning. Close your eyes if you wish. We have a very long journey ahead. We continue our story. The descendants of Abraham had settled in the land of Canaan. But the ancient world was not a stable place. A famine came to Canaan, severe, prolonged, the kind that empties granaries and hollows out the faces of children. And so one of Jacob's sons, a young man named Joseph, went ahead to Egypt, the great civilization of the Nile, where the floods came every year and the land was rich, and there was food when other places had none. According to the Hebrew Bible, Joseph rose to a position of extraordinary power in Egypt. He became an advisor to Pharaoh. And when his brothers followed him, fleeing the famine, the family of Jacob settled in Egypt. They prospered there. They multiplied. And then the generations passed, and a new Pharaoh came to power. One who did not remember Joseph. One who looked at this people who were not Egyptian and saw not guests but a threat. He enslaved them. For generations, the descendants of Abraham built the monuments of Egypt under the sun, under the whip, in a land that was not their own. And then a man was born in a basket on the Nile. His name was Moses. Moses grew up in the courts of Pharaoh, an Israelite raised as an Egyptian. A man caught between two worlds who killed an Egyptian overseer. He saw beating an Israelite slave who fled into the desert, who heard a voice in a burning bush. The same voice that spoke to Abraham. Go. The voice said, return to Egypt and bring my people out. What followed is one of the most told stories in all of human history. The plagues, the Passover, the parting of the waters, the Exodus. Whether one reads this as divine miracle or as ancient memory of a historical migration, the story has shaped the consciousness of billions. After 40 years in the desert, after a generation of wandering, the descendants of Abraham arrived at the edge of the land they had been promised, the land of Canaan. In our next chapter, they enter it, and a kingdom begins. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The Israelites have entered Canaan, the land of their ancestors, the land of the promise. For generations, they live as a loose confederation of 12 tribes, united by language and faith, but without a central government, without a king. In times of danger, a leader called a judge would rise to defend them. And when the danger passed, the tribes would return to governing themselves. But the world around them is not cooperative. The Philistines press from the coast. Other peoples test the borders. The tribes begin to feel that they need something more. A king, a standing army, a permanent center of power. Around 150 before the Common Era, the prophet Samuel anoints a man named Saul as the first king of Israel, a tall man, a warrior, who begins well and ends in tragedy. After Saul comes David. David is one of the most remarkable figures in all of ancient history. A shepherd from Bethlehem, a poet and musician, credited with composing many of the Psalms, a warrior of extraordinary courage, a man who is remembered as a king after God's own heart, despite his very real failures. David unites the 12 tribes. He defeats the Philistines. He captures the city of Jerusalem and makes it his capital, the city of David, the eternal city. And then comes Solomon, David's son, who rules over a kingdom at the height of its power and prosperity, who builds the most magnificent structure his people have ever seen. A temple in Jerusalem, on the hill above the city, built of cedar from Lebanon and stone quarried from the mountains. A house for God, a center for worship, an expression of everything this people believes about themselves and their relationship with the divine. Solomon's temple, the first temple. In our next chapter, we enter that temple. and watch what happens when it falls. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. Solomon rules Israel at the height of its power, around 970 before the Common Era. His kingdom stretches from the Euphrates in the north to the borders of Egypt in the south. Trade routes pass through his lands. Caravans arrive from distant places. The Queen of Sheba comes to test his legendary wisdom and leaves impressed. But Solomon's greatest achievement is not military. It is not diplomatic. It is the temple. On a hill in Jerusalem, on a flat rock of ancient stone, Solomon builds a structure, the like of which his people have never seen. Cedar wood from Lebanon, quarried stone from the hills, gold from the far south, the finest craftsmen of the ancient world, working for 7 years. Inside the temple, in its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, rests the Ark of the Covenant, the container, according to tradition, that holds the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were inscribed. The temple is not merely a building. It is the center of a world, the place where heaven and earth touch, where the divine presence dwells among the people. For more than 3 centuries, it stands. And then, in the year 586 before the Common Era, a king named Nebuchadnezzar leads his Babylonian armies to the gates of Jerusalem. The city falls. The walls are torn down. The temple is burned. The sacred objects are carried away. And the people of Judah are taken in chains to Babylon. They sit by the rivers of Babylon, and they weep when they remember Zion. These are not just words from an ancient text. This is a wound that has never fully healed. In our next chapter, we follow the exiles into captivity and watch how a people keeps itself alive, far from home. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is 586 before the Common Era. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple is ash. The walls are rubble. The people of Judah are marched east through the desert into Babylon, the great empire of the Tigris and Euphrates, modern-day Iraq. This is the Babylonian captivity, one of the defining events in the history of the Jewish people. How do you remain a people without a land, without a temple, without the physical center of everything you believe? This is the question the exiles face in Babylon. Surrounded by a foreign culture, pressured to assimilate, to forget, to become something else. They do not forget. They write, they compile, they gather the stories and laws and histories that will become the Hebrew Bible. They develop the synagogue, a place of gathering and prayer that requires no temple, no sacrifices, just community and text. In exile, the Jewish people do something remarkable. They transform their faith into something that can survive anywhere. Without a land, without a temple, carried in the mind and in the book. And then, in 538 before the Common Era, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon and issues a remarkable decree. The exiled peoples may return to their homelands. The Jews may go home. Not all of them go. Many have built lives in Babylon, have children and grandchildren who know no other home. But some go. They return to the ruins of Jerusalem. They rebuild the walls, they construct a second temple, smaller than the first, less magnificent, but standing. In our next chapter, the empires of the ancient world roll over this small land one after another, and a people learns to survive them all. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The second temple stands in Jerusalem. The walls are rebuilt. The people have returned from Babylon. A fragile restoration in an uncertain world. But the ancient world belongs to empires, and empires do not stand still. The Persians ruled this land with relative tolerance. They allowed the Jews to practice their faith, to rebuild, to worship, to govern their own affairs within the limits the empire permitted. Then came Alexander. In 332 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great swept through the Levant on his way to Egypt and Persia. He took the land without great violence. Jerusalem surrendered peacefully. But what Alexander brought was more powerful than armies. He brought Greek culture, Greek language, Greek ideas, Greek ways of thinking about the world, the gods, the self. This created a crisis within the Jewish community. How much of Greek culture could one absorb and still remain Jewish? How much could change before something essential was lost? The tension erupted in 1607 before the Common Era, when a Greek Syrian king named Antiochus desecrated the temple, placing idols inside it, forbidding Jewish practice, attempting to force assimilation by law and by violence. The response was armed rebellion, led by a family called the Maccabees, Judah Maccabee and his brothers, who fought a guerrilla war against a vastly superior force, and won. The temple was reclaimed, purified, rededicated. This victory is celebrated to this day as Hanukkah, the festival of lights. But independence did not last. In 63 before the Common Era, the Roman general Pompey arrived in Jerusalem. He entered the city. He walked into the temple, into the Holy of Holies itself, the most sacred space in Judaism, where only the high priest was permitted to enter once a year. He looked around and left. Rome had arrived, and Rome would not leave for centuries. In our next chapter, the most catastrophic event in ancient Jewish history unfolds beneath the Roman eagle. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the year 70 of the Common Era. Rome rules the known world from the shores of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, a vast empire, held together by roads and laws and legions. But in the small province of Judea, something Rome has not been able to extinguish is burning. Rebellion. For 4 years, the Jewish people have been in open revolt against Roman rule, the Great Jewish Revolt. A desperate, courageous, and ultimately doomed uprising against the most powerful military the ancient world has ever seen. In the summer of 70, the Roman general Titus lays siege to Jerusalem. The city holds for months inside the walls. Famine sets in. People eat leather, eat grass. Some eat things that cannot be spoken of. And then the walls break. The Romans pour into the city, fighting street by street, house by house. And then the temple. Whether by order or by accident, the historical sources disagree, but the result is the same. The Second Temple burns. The great structure that had stood for centuries, that had been the center of Jewish worship for half a millennium, burns until only one wall remains. The Western Wall, the last remnant of the platform on which the temple stood. Jews have come to that wall to mourn and to pray. For nearly 2,000 years they still come today, pressing small pieces of paper with their prayers into its ancient stones. After the destruction of the temple, Rome did something else. They renamed the province, no longer Judea. They called it Palestina, Palestine, named after the ancient Philistines, a deliberate attempt to sever the connection between the Jewish people and this land. In our next chapter, we follow those people as they scatter across the world and ask how a nation survives without a homeland for 2,000 years. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The temple is gone. Jerusalem is rubble. The Jewish people scatter across the Roman Empire and beyond. This scattering is called the Diaspora, from the Greek word for dispersion, the spreading of a people across the face of the earth. They go everywhere, to Rome and Alexandria, to Babylon and Persia, to the shores of North Africa, and the cities of Spain, to the villages of Poland, and the markets of Yemen. They carry with them the same thing they carried out of Babylon centuries before. Not land, not walls, not a temple. The book, the law, the memory. Wherever they go, they build synagogues, they gather on the Sabbath. They read the same texts, observe the same holidays, light the same candles, ask the same questions, at the same table, at Passover. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of cultural preservation in human history. A people maintaining its identity across 20 centuries, across dozens of countries, across hundreds of languages. But it is not a peaceful wandering. In medieval Europe, Jews are expelled from one country after another. England in 1290, France repeatedly, Spain in 1492. The same year Columbus sailed to the New World. They are accused of crimes they did not commit, blamed for plagues and failures, confined to ghettos, forced to wear identifying marks, massacred in pogroms from the Rhine Valley to the plains of Ukraine. And yet, they endure, they adapt, they remember. Every year at Passover, they say the same words. Next year in Jerusalem. For 2,000 years, those words are a prayer, a longing, a hope that seems too distant to be real. In our next chapter, a man in Vienna decides to make it real. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the late 19th century. Europe is changing faster than it has ever changed before. Industrialization, nationalism, the rise of the modern state, the idea that people who share a language and culture should have their own country. For Jewish people in Europe, this era brings both hope and danger. In some countries, legal restrictions on Jews are being lifted. Jews can vote, can own property, can attend universities, can enter professions that were closed to them for centuries. But in other places, something darker is rising. Modern anti-Semitism, not merely the old religious hatred, but a new political hatred, one that uses the language of race and nation and purity, one that blames Jews for the disruptions of modernity, for economic anxieties, for social change. In 1894 in Paris, a young Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl covers the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, falsely accused of treason, convicted on fabricated evidence, stripped of his rank before a jeering crowd. And as Herzl watches, the crowd chants, "Death to the Jews." In Paris, the city of the Enlightenment, the city of liberty, equality, fraternity. Herzl concludes something that will change history. The Jewish people cannot rely on the goodwill of the nations where they live. As long as they are a minority everywhere, they will always be vulnerable. The only solution, he believes, is a state, a Jewish state, a place where Jews can govern themselves, defend themselves, be responsible for their own fate. In 1896, he publishes a pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. In 1897, he convenes the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. 200 delegates from around the world, debating, arguing, dreaming about a homeland. Most of the world ignores them. History does not. In our next chapter, the dream begins to collide with the realities of land, empire, and war. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the early 20th century. The world is changing with extraordinary speed. Jewish immigrants have been arriving in Palestine in waves since the 1880s. They call these waves Aliyah, a Hebrew word meaning ascent, rising up. The land they arrive in is part of the Ottoman Empire, a vast but weakening power that has controlled this region for 400 years. The new arrivals drain swamps, plant forests, build towns, create institutions. Schools, hospitals, newspapers in Hebrew, a language that had not been spoken in daily life for nearly 2,000 years, and is being revived, word by word, family by family. Then comes the First World War. The Ottoman Empire enters on the side of Germany, and Britain finds itself fighting across the Middle East. Britain needs allies and promises. It makes many promises to many people about the future of this land. Some of those promises will prove impossible to keep. On the 2nd of November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, sends a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The letter is short, barely 100 words, but those words reshape the future of a region. His Majesty's government, the letter says, views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration. A national home, not a state, not yet, but an acknowledgement, a promise from the most powerful empire in the world. The Arab population of Palestine, which forms the majority of those living there, is not consulted. The letter notes that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. But what those words mean in practice will be contested for the next century and beyond. In our next chapter, the worst catastrophe in Jewish history makes this question suddenly, desperately urgent. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. There are moments in history that resist ordinary language. The Holocaust is one of them. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany. They built their movement on hatred, on the idea that the Jewish people were a threat to be eliminated, not expelled, not converted, eliminated. What followed was the most systematic attempt at genocide in recorded human history. Concentration camps, death camps, gas chambers, built with industrial efficiency, operated with bureaucratic precision by a modern European state. 6 million Jewish men, women and children were murdered. 6 million. 1/3 of all the Jewish people in the world. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped from the earth. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, the cultured Jewish communities of Germany and Austria, the ancient Jewish quarters of Amsterdam, Paris, Rome, gone. For those who survived, the question of where to go was desperate and immediate. Many wanted to go to Palestine, to the land of the promise, to a place where Jews would not depend on the goodwill of others for their survival. But the British, who governed Palestine, severely restricted Jewish immigration. Even as the camps were being liberated, even as survivors, with nowhere else to go, tried to reach the shores of their ancient homeland. The world watched, and the pressure built toward a decision that could no longer be delayed. In our next chapter, the United Nations attempts to solve an impossible problem. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is 1947. The Second World War is over. The Holocaust has ended. The world has seen what it allowed to happen and is trying to reckon with what that means. Britain is exhausted. Its empire is fraying. It can no longer manage the impossible situation in Palestine, where Jewish immigrants are arriving in growing numbers, where Arab Palestinians are resisting those arrivals, where underground Jewish militias are fighting British forces, where no solution seems to satisfy anyone. Britain hands the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN sends a committee to investigate. They travel through Palestine. They interview Jews and Arabs. They study the land, the demographics, the history. And in November 1947, the United Nations proposes a solution. Partition. divide the land into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration, a shared city, a holy city, belonging to everyone and no one. The Jewish leadership accepts with reservations, with heartache about the parts of the ancient land they will not have, but they accept. The Arab states reject. They argue that the land belongs to those who live there, but the Arab majority should not have to give up half their homeland to accommodate the victims of a European crime they did not commit. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations votes 33 nations in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. Resolution 18-1 passes. In Jewish communities around the world, people pour into the streets. They dance, they weep. They cannot believe that after 2,000 years, the vote has finally come. In Arab communities, there is fury and a promise that the partition will never be implemented. Both sides begin to prepare for what comes next. In our next chapter, the British leave, and the moment of decision arrives. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 14th of May, 1948. A Friday afternoon, Tel Aviv. In a building on Rothschild Boulevard, a hall has been decorated with a portrait of Theodor Herzl, the man who dreamed of this moment 50 years before, who did not live to see it. 250 people have gathered. Leaders, intellectuals, rabbis, workers, soldiers still in uniform, people who have come from every corner of the earth, from Europe's death camps, from the mountains of Yemen, from the cities of America, from the fields of Palestine itself. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, a man stands at the podium. His name is David Ben-Gurion, a short, stocky man with a halo of white hair, born in Poland, arrived in Palestine as a young man, spent his life building toward this moment. He begins to read. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. He reads for 16 minutes. And at the end, he announces the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, to be called Israel. The room erupts, people weep openly. Men who have not cried in years cannot stop themselves. Women who survived the camps hold each other. The ancient prayer rises spontaneously from dozens of voices. Shehechianu, blessed are you, Lord our God, who has kept us alive and sustained us and brought us to this season. 11 minutes later, the United States recognizes the new state. The dream of 2,000 years has become a country. But before the ink is dry on the declaration, The armies are already moving. In our next chapter, 5 Arab nations cross the border. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The ink on the Declaration is barely dry. Within hours of Israel's proclamation of independence, on May 14, 1948, the armies begin to move. Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria from the north, Iraq and Lebanon joining the assault. 5 Arab armies against a newborn state, with no formal military, with weapons smuggled in pieces through ports, with volunteers who had survived the concentration camps of Europe and were now picking up rifles in the hills of Galilee. The world expected Israel to fall, quickly, overwhelmingly. The numbers did not favor survival, but Israel did not fall. The fighting was desperate, brutal, costly, on both sides. The Israelis fought with the ferocity of people who had nowhere else to go, who knew what losing meant, who had seen what the world allowed to happen to Jews who had no state to protect them. By 1949, a series of armistice agreements were signed. The war had ended. Israel had survived. But the war left wounds that have never healed. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting. They and their descendants call this the Nakba, the catastrophe. They went to refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many of those camps still exist today, nearly 80 years later. Israel calls 1948 its War of Independence. Palestinians call it the greatest catastrophe of their modern history. Both of these things are true simultaneously. That is the nature of this conflict. That is why it has proven so difficult to resolve. In our next chapter, a war that lasts 6 days changes the map of the region forever. Rest now, the story continues. We continue our story. The ink on the Declaration is barely dry. Within hours of Israel's proclamation of independence, on May 14, 1948, the armies begin to move. Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria from the north, Iraq and Lebanon joining the assault. 5 Arab armies against a newborn state, with no formal military, with weapons smuggled in pieces through ports, with volunteers who had survived the concentration camps of Europe and were now picking up rifles in the hills of Galilee. The world expected Israel to fall, quickly, overwhelmingly. The numbers did not favor survival, but Israel did not fall. The fighting was desperate, brutal, costly, on both sides. The Israelis fought with the ferocity of people who had nowhere else to go, who knew what losing meant, who had seen what the world allowed to happen to Jews who had no state to protect them. By 1949, a series of armistice agreements was signed. The war had ended. Israel had survived. But the war left wounds that have never healed. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting. They and their descendants call this the Nakba, the catastrophe. They went to refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many of those camps still exist today, nearly 80 years later. Both of these things are true simultaneously. That is the nature of this conflict. That is why it has proven so difficult to resolve. In our next chapter, a war that lasts 6 days changes the map of the region forever. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is June 1967. Israel is 19 years old, a young state, still fragile, still surrounded by nations that do not accept its existence. Tensions have been building for months. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser has been massing troops in the Sinai Peninsula. He has closed the Straits of Tyre to Israeli shipping, an act that Israel has said it would treat as an act of war. Syria and Jordan signed defense pacts with Egypt. Arab radio broadcasts speak of the coming liberation, of driving the Jews into the sea. Israel decides not to wait. On the morning of June 5th, the Israeli Air Force launches a preemptive strike against the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before the planes can take off. Within hours, the Egyptian Air Force is destroyed on the ground. In the first morning of the war. Over the next 6 days, Israel fights on 3 fronts: against Egypt in the south, against Jordan in the east, against Syria in the north. 6 days. When the ceasefire comes, Israel has tripled in size. The Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, the Old City, the Western Wall, the holiest place in Judaism, which had been under Jordanian control since 1948. Now in Israeli hands for the first time in 2,000 years. An Israeli general walked to the Western Wall and wept. The 6-day war transformed everything. It made Israel a regional military power. It gave it strategic depth, but it also gave it something more complicated. Millions of Palestinians now living under Israeli military rule in the West Bank and Gaza, without citizenship, without the same rights as Israeli citizens. A situation that continues to define the conflict to this day. In our next chapter, the Arab world strikes back on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is October 6, 1973, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a day of fasting and prayer, of synagogues full and streets empty, of radios silent and cars still. At 2 p.m, the silence breaks. Egypt and Syria launch a coordinated surprise attack on 2 fronts simultaneously. Egypt crosses the Suez Canal into the Israeli-held Sinai. Syrian tanks pour down from the Golan Heights toward the Israeli heartland. Israel is caught almost completely off guard. The Israeli intelligence services had received warnings, but had concluded with the confident certainty that sometimes precedes disaster, that the Arabs would not attack, that they were not ready, that the timing made no sense. They were wrong. In the first days of the war, Israeli forces are pushed back on both fronts. Soldiers are called from synagogues in their prayer shawls. Reservists are mobilized in hours instead of days. The situation is desperate. Israel's defense minister later says that the country came within hours of military collapse. But Israel does not collapse. Within days, the tide begins to turn. Israeli forces cross the Suez Canal into Egypt proper. They push the Syrians back, beyond the 1967 lines, and advance to within artillery range of Damascus. A ceasefire is reached, under pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The war ends, but nothing is the same. The myth of Israeli invincibility has been shattered. The trauma of almost losing sits deep in the national psyche. And from that trauma, surprisingly, comes peace. In our next chapter, Israel makes its first peace with an Arab neighbor and tries to find a way to live with the Palestinians. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. The Yom Kippur War has ended, but its tremors continue to reshape the Middle East. In 1977, something extraordinary happens. The Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, boards a plane and flies to Israel. He is the first Arab leader to visit the Jewish state. He speaks before the Knesset, Israel's parliament. He says that Egypt wants peace, real peace, is stunned. The world is stunned. 2 years of negotiations follow, mediated by American President Jimmy Carter at Camp David in Maryland. In 1979, Egypt and Israel sign a peace treaty, the first between Israel and any Arab nation. Israel returns the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Egypt recognizes Israel's right to exist. It is a moment of genuine hope of a different future becoming imaginable. Sadat pays for it with his life. He is assassinated in 1981 by Egyptian extremists who consider the peace a betrayal. But the peace holds. It holds to this day. In 1993, another breakthrough in secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway, Israel, and the Palestine Liberation Organization reach an agreement, the Oslo Accords. Israel recognizes the PLO. The PLO recognizes Israel. A Palestinian authority is established to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The framework for a two-state solution seems finally within reach. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shake hands on the White House lawn, an image that shocks the world. 2 years later, Rabin is shot dead by an Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process. The peace process stumbles, then slows, then collapses. By 2000, a second intifada begins. Years of suicide bombings, of military operations, of checkpoints and barriers, of a wall built through the West Bank. The dream of Oslo fades into the dust of a conflict that seems to have no end. In our next chapter, Israel withdraws from Gaza, and something far worse moves in. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is 2005. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon makes a decision that surprises almost everyone who knows him. Sharon is not a man associated with compromise. He is a general, a warrior, a man who spent his life fighting for every inch of Israeli territory. And yet he orders the withdrawal of all Israeli forces and all Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip. 8,000 Israeli settlers are removed from their homes. Some are carried out by Israeli soldiers, weeping, resisting, refusing to leave the places where they were born. Sharon believes the withdrawal will bring security, will remove a source of conflict, will show the world that Israel is willing to make painful concessions for peace. What happens instead changes everything. In 2006, Palestinians in Gaza vote in elections. Hamas wins, a movement that has built its political identity on the rejection of Israel's existence that is carried out. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities, that is designated a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and many other countries. In 2007, after violent clashes with the rival Fatah movement, Hamas takes complete control of Gaza. Gaza becomes something new, a strip of land, 240 square kilometers, home to more than 2 million people, governed by an organization committed to Israel's destruction, blockaded by Israel and Egypt, cut off from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. In the years that follow, rockets are fired from Gaza into Israel. Israel launches military operations into Gaza. In 2008, in 2012, in 2014, in 2021. Each one more destructive than the last, each one failing to resolve the fundamental problem. A people in misery, a conflict with no end, a region holding its breath. In our next chapter, the breath is released in the most violent way in a generation. Rest now. The story continues. We continue our story. It is the 7th of October, 2023. A Saturday morning, a Jewish holiday, the last day of Sukkot. In the communities near the Gaza border, people are sleeping, farmers, families, children. People who have lived alongside the border their entire lives, who have learned to run to bomb shelters when the sirens sound, who have built routines around the rhythm of an uncomfortable peace. And at a music festival in the desert nearby, thousands of young people dancing as the sun rises. At 6:30 in the morning, Hamas launches more than 3,000 rockets toward Israeli cities. And then the fences fall. Thousands of Hamas militants pour through the Gaza border, on foot, on motorcycles, in pickup trucks. What follows is the deadliest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. 1,200 people are killed in their homes, at the music festival, in the kibbutzim that have stood for generations. Babies, grandparents, soldiers and civilians, people of many nationalities. 250 people are taken into Gaza as hostages. Israel is shattered, the intelligence failure, the images that emerge from the communities near the border, the stories that survivors tell. It is a wound that the country does not know how to carry. Israel declares war on Hamas. The military enters Gaza. What follows is one of the most destructive conflicts in the region's modern history. Tens of thousands killed. The majority of Gaza's buildings damaged or destroyed. More than 1 million people displaced within the strip. The world divides again, as it always does, over this conflict. Those who emphasize Israel's right to defend itself. Those who emphasize the suffering of Palestinian civilians. Both things simultaneously true. Both things simultaneously insufficient as an answer. In our final chapter, we step back and look at the full arc of this ancient and modern story. Rest now. The story continues. We arrive at the end of our story. Though it is not an end, it is a moment in a story that continues. It is 2026. Israel is 78 years old, a young country by almost any measure, and yet carrying the weight of 4,000 years of history on its shoulders. The war in Gaza that began after October 7 has reshaped the region. Israel has fought, not only in Gaza, but in Lebanon, where Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel in support of Hamas, and Israel responded with a ground invasion. Iran, the principal backer of Hamas and Hezbollah, has been drawn into a direct confrontation with Israel and the United States. The war that many feared for decades has begun. Israel stands at a crossroads. It has stood it before, surrounded by enemies, supported by allies, uncertain of its future, but refusing to accept that it has no future. Inside Israel, the society is deeply divided about the war, about the hostages, about the direction of the country, about what kind of state Israel should be, religious or secular, democratic or authoritarian, at peace or at war. The Palestinian people remain without a state. The two-state solution that seemed within reach in the 1990s now seems further away than at any point in a generation. And yet, this is a land and a people that have survived what should not have been survivable. The destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian captivity, the Roman exile, 2,000 years of wandering, the Holocaust, 5 wars in 5 years, Intifada, suicide bombings, October 7. And still, every Friday evening, candles are lit in kitchens, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Children ask the 4 questions at the Passover table. The ancient prayers rise in ancient languages from modern throats. The story of Israel is not finished. It has never been finished. It is a story that is still being written in blood and in hope, in conflict and in longing, in the ancient words that have echoed across 4,000 years. Next year in Jerusalem. Tonight we have followed that story together, from Abraham's journey across the ancient world to the headlines of this morning. Slowly, calmly, with as much fairness as history allows. Now rest. The story has been told.